Nazareth Catholic College. My name is Paul Holy, I'm the chairman of Debating SA. 2020 has been an interesting year in a number of ways, but I'm very glad that we've been able to put together a face-to-face competition for the students, albeit with a reduced number of minor rounds. This debate this afternoon is obviously the culmination of that competition for these two teams. So at this point, I'll hand over to Madam Chairman, who will start proceedings.
Ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the 2020 Senior Division Debating SA Grand Final debate. My name is Gabby Waldorf-Davis and I'm the chairman of this debate. The timekeeper is Sophie Russell. The topic of this debate is that there should be constitutional recognition of Indigenous Australians. The affirmative team seated to my right is from Pembroke School, consisting of first speaker Emil Smith, second speaker Dylan Horswick, and third speaker Max Briggs. The negative team seated to my left from Brighton Secondary School consists of first speaker Mina Johansson, second speaker Nicholas Burkock, and third speaker Finn Madden. This grand final debate will be judged by a panel of 5 adjudicators who are Paul Hoadley, Sonia Lowen, Jenny Burrows, Lachlan Helmsley and Blake Wadlow. The speaking time of this debate is 8 minutes. A single warning bell will sound at 7 minutes and a double bell will sound at 8 minutes. If required, a continuous bell will sound 30 seconds after the second bell, indicating that the speaker must conclude their speech. I ask that all mobile phones and other electronic devices be switched off for the duration of the debate. I declare this debate open and call upon Emil to open the affirmative case.
Good afternoon, Madam Chairman, ladies and gentlemen. The topic for today's debate is that there should be constitutional recognition of Indigenous Australians. We, the affirmative team, strongly believe that this statement is true. In this topic, we define the Constitution as the document by which Australia is governed, that can only be changed through a referendum involving the Australian people. The Constitution establishes the composition of the Australian Federal Parliament, describes how Parliament works and what powers it has. It also outlines how the federal and state parliaments share power and the roles of the executive government and the High Court of Australia. Further, we define constitutional recognition as being in accordance with the Uluru Statement from the heart, whereby Indigenous people would be acknowledged as First Nations people and would have a greater voice. They ask for a First Nations voice to be enshrined in the Constitution. This would also include prescribing basic Indigenous rights in the Constitution. This recognition of rights would include a more specific outline of native title and a clause to encapsulate aspirations for greater equality. It also implies that a joint standing committee on Indigenous rights should be established to ensure there is accountability for Indigenous issues. We have chosen the Uluru Statement from the heart as is a recent and bipartisan effort to consolidate these views and was created from meetings with over 1,200 representatives of Indigenous Australian communities. It also has wide public support, with research conducted by the Crosby Texter Group showing that less than a fifth of Australians would reject such proposed changes to the Constitution. We would like to acknowledge the limitations of our perspective in this debate, in that we cannot speak strongly as to the collective experience of Indigenous Australians. We acknowledge that there would be greater value in allowing for Indigenous voices to speak on this topic. However, given the nature of the debate format, we intend to discuss the issues with the utmost respect towards Indigenous Australians, past and present, and I'm sure the opposition feels the same way. As first speaker, I will be discussing 2 points. First, I will talk about the purpose of federation and its racist elements, and the lack of change in the Constitution to reflect modern social values. For my second point, I will discuss the deep symbolic value of the preamble in the Constitution and how it is culturally insensitive. Our second speaker, Dylan, will be discussing the colonisation of Australia under terra nullius and how this didn't conform with international law at the time. He'll also talk about how the recognition of Indigenous people and rights would improve recognition of Indigenous Australians. For my first point today, I'll be talking about the Federation of Australia, which created the Constitution and the motives of excluding people of colour from Australian society. The Federation of Australia was the process by which 6 separate British colonies agreed to unite and become states within the newly formed Commonwealth of Australia, keeping the systems of government for individual states, but creating a new federal government to deal with overarching Australian issues. This change was marked by the introduction of the Constitution of Australia on January the 1st, 1901. When it was written, one of the main objectives of the Australian Parliament was to make Australia a white society. As John Forrest put it at the Australasian Federation Convention of 1898, it is of no use to shut our eyes to the fact that there is a great feeling all over Australia against the introduction of coloured persons. And that is certainly mirrored in the Immigration Restricted Act of 1901, or the White Australia Policy, and other acts relating to Indigenous people, such as the introduction of the Stolen Generations. This same attitude towards foreign people of colour was similar to the treatment towards the pre-existing Indigenous peoples of Australia, with the Constitution of Australia, and thus Federation, having had no input from Indigenous Australians. It was written at a time when most Indigenous Australians didn't have the right to vote, or, according to the National Museum of Australia, didn't know their voting rights or had no access to voting facilities. From this, it's clear to see that this document needs updating, as the Constitution is severely out of date and backwards in modern society, due to the intentions of excluding people of colour from participating in Australia, a view widely rejected in modern society. Now to my second point, that the extensive symbolic value of the preamble makes its contents culturally insensitive. The preamble, defined as the introductory part of a document stating its purpose, aims and justification, is a key part of the Australian Constitution, and has been used as a genuine source of information about the reach of legislative power in the High Court. According to Anne Winkle, in the University of New South Wales Law Journal, the Australian High Court has viewed the preamble as a legitimate source from which to infer limitations on Commonwealth legislative power, as shown by the Leith v Commonwealth case. However, the legal status of the preamble is far outweighed by its symbolic value, as a constitution is a body of fundamental principles according to which a state is acknowledged to be governed. The preamble essentially sets the tone for how Australia should be governed, being described as a guide to the intentions of those who are responsible for it by Mark McKenna in a paper published by Parliament House. The preamble states that the Constitution is under the blessing of Almighty God. We acknowledge that this statement could be contested for a variety of reasons, although we believe it is particularly inappropriate in relation to Indigenous belief systems and fails to show respect toward those systems, especially in regards to the spiritual connection with land and country, which is completely overlooked in regards to a Christian God. Additionally, the preamble states that the states will unite under the Crown of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. However, these verses do not include the rich multicultural society that we today enjoy in Australia, and certainly doesn't have any reference towards Indigenous Australians and their preoccupation of the land. Since this is the document that outlines how our government, our society, will be run, it is important that it includes all people within it. While in the context of 1901, it was popular belief that Australia should be an all-white society, since multiculturalism as a policy only emerged in the 1970s under the Whitlam and Fraser governments. Australia has been described as a multicultural success story by the Australian Human Rights Commission. From this relatively recent change, it can be seen that the preamble is culturally insensitive, as it establishes ingrained and systemic racism within the very document which establishes our government. It is important to recognise Indigenous people, as this serves to alleviate the injustices of the past and move forward with Australian society. While we acknowledge that this decision won't fix everything, we believe it to be a step in the right direction and has significant symbolic value in resolving past conflicts between Indigenous Australians and the Federal Government of Australia. So, ladies and gentlemen, Madam Chairman, in conclusion, we, the Affirmative team, strongly believe that there should be constitutional recognition of Indigenous Australians. From the intentions behind Federation, and thus the Constitution, being intentionally exclusionary towards the Indigenous people, to the insensitive symbolic value of the preamble, it is clear that Indigenous Australians deserve constitutional recognition. We have since changed many of those laws from the same era, and our frame of mind has certainly changed significantly. So why shouldn't we change the basis upon which the Australian government rests? Thank you.
call upon Mina to open the negative case.
Good afternoon, Madam Chairman, ladies and gentlemen. The topic for this afternoon's debate is that there should be constitutional recognition of Indigenous Australians. We, the negative team, firmly believe that this statement is false. We agree with the definition given by the Affirmative team. However, to specify, we also define Indigenous Australians as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island people. However, we oppose with their definition of constitutional recognition, and I would like to elaborate why. Prior to the Aboriginal Land Rights Act of 1976, the term constitutional recognition exclusively referred to the symbolic recognition of Australia's Indigenous peoples within the Constitution. However, since then, constitutional recognition has become a blanket term used to describe many forms of constitutional change designed to benefit Indigenous Australians. As of today, constitutional recognition has many forms and no definitive definition. It is an indefinite term since it contains a spectrum of meanings, and it could vary purely from symbolic change to the amendment of outdated clauses. The most radical form of constitutional recognition yet proposed is the Uluru Statement, and it suggests that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders to have a voice within the Constitution when the Commonwealth Parliament exercises to make laws under Section 151 and 122. And we would like to note that this proposal was rejected by Malcolm Turnbull. Before I introduce our team case, I would like to point out some flaws within the opposition statement. The first affirmative speaker has tried to tell you about racism within Constitution and Federation, and that there should be changes made in the preamble. Additionally, it also excludes people of colour like Aboriginals. Yes, this is true. However, they still should not receive constitutional recognition because there are better alternatives than that. For example, like a treaty, which will give Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders the right recognition and resolve the injustice that they've reserved. I'll discuss this further in my second point. Today, as first speaker, I'll be talking about how giving Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people constitutional recognition is a symbolic gesture rather than a tool to drive real change. I will also be discussing about how this is ineffectual and there are alternate solutions to giving Aboriginal people like a treaty, which will recognise them as a sovereign state. Our second speaker will be talking about how Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders are simply uninterested in being recognised by the Constitution. He will also address how the constitutional recognition of Indigenous Australians is an example of Aboriginal sovereignty being made by white Australians. Our third speaker will rebut and sum up our team case. My first point is that the constitutional recognition of Indigenous Australians will be nothing but a symbolic gesture throughout history. Yes, symbolic gestures do matter, however, it needs to be coupled up with real tangible change. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders do not seek for more symbols within the Constitution. They seek for change that will actually make a difference. Take the 1967 referendum, for example. It was a tokenistic act and it recognised Indigenous people as human beings. The referendum proposed that it would bring Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders to a greater recognition and start a new progressive era of Aboriginal affairs. However, Russell Taylor, the Chief Executive Officer of the Australian Institute of Aboriginal Studies, as well as an individual who experienced the impact of the referendum, stated there was absolutely no evidence to me that anything had changed at all. Indeed, I remember discussing about the right to legally patronise and be served in hotels as an outcome of the referendum. The 2008 Kevin Rudd apology is another example of a symbolic act that did not drive real change. An apology from the Prime Minister was highly symbolic and celebrated at that time. However, Kevin Rudd's words don't mean much when statistics from the Australian Human Rights Commission in 2009 showed that the rate of Indigenous children being forcibly removed from their homes was 7 times the rate of the non-Indigenous. Ladies and gentlemen, this was exactly 1 year after the apology. May I ask, where is the real change at? Do you think there should be constitutional recognition of Aboriginal people if history goes down like this? The government needs to come to the table, rather than assuming that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders will happily assimilate into their visions of Australia without a framework for justice. Mary Graham, Kumba woman, said that constitutional recognition is a way of promising something but with no real substance. And the truth behind statements like this is that for many Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, the goal is not constitutional recognition or reform. Their goal is sovereignty. And therefore, there should not be constitutional recognition of Indigenous Australians because it's ineffectual and it leads to no real action. This brings me to my second point. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island people need a treaty, not recognition. The Uluru Statement explicitly states, this link is the basis of the ownership of the soil, or better, sovereignty. It introduces sovereignty, which is what the Aboriginal people want. However, its place in a constitutional statement is completely futile. Treaties and constitutions serve two different purposes. A treaty is a contract between two sovereign parties, while a constitution is a set of governing laws. A treaty is an agreement with guarantees, promises, and responsibilities, which is something a constitution does not offer. And under a treaty, hosts and guests have rights and obligations, and what is honoured in the relationship stems from conventions and laws that protect both parties. Also, Indigenous commitment to a treaty process has been expressed nationwide since the year 2000. However, it has yet to be taken seriously by politicians, and that's why constitutional recognition is being offered. Here's an analogy from Nayuka Gori. Imagine living in a share house. You have rules, you have food, and you pay your rent on time. Then suddenly, some random shows up and uses your utilities. After 228 years, you're like, can we talk about the time where you moved in and did not ask? Your only real choice is to ask them to sign on to the lease, but instead, your housemate says they'll recognise you, and they'll ask all their friends which way would be the best way to do it. Ladies and gentlemen, this is constitutional recognition. Is this the right way to treat Indigenous Australians? Or an alternative is to give them a treaty which acknowledges them as a sovereign body. The constitutional recognition of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders will shackle them and will never be as effective and will never have the ability to give them the same freedom and control like a treaty. So, Madam Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, we're here arguing for the benefit of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island people. Therefore, we should offer what they want, which is sovereignty. The fight for recognition carry the hope that they would be seen not just as equals, but as people who have a distinct connection to this country. And we, the negative team, firmly believe that constitutional recognition is a band-aid solution for a gaping wound. Thank you.
To continue the affirmative case, please welcome Dylan.
Good afternoon, ladies, gentlemen, timekeeper and chairman. The topic for today's debate is that there should be constitutional recognition of Indigenous Australians, and we, the affirmative team, strongly believe this statement to be true. Our first speaker has already discussed the context of colonisation and how the preamble is symbolically racist. He spoke about the need for greater inclusiveness. Today, as second speaker, I will speak to you about the colonisation of Australia under terra nullius and how this does not conform with international law at the time. I will also illustrate that the legal protection of Indigenous Australians is contingent on constitutional recognition. I will first illustrate some flaws in the opposition case. The opposition has stated that the alteration of the Constitution is tokenistic and will not improve the welfare of Indigenous people. This is false as illustrated by my first speaker, the Constitution has significant symbolic value. It's important to consider that this document determines how our nation is run, and in turn how society itself functions. Altering this document has an immense impact on lawmaking, and in turn how laws, which govern our lives, are made. Clearly, altering the preamble is far from futile, and will ensure Indigenous people can constitutionally challenge injustice and have a reliable document to turn to. Thus, amendment will be highly effectual. She's also stated that this is a merely symbolic act which will not have any legal standing or provide any real results. This is false as, in accordance with our definition which was agreed to, a joint standing committee is far from symbolic. Having a permanent committee is far from irrelevant. While we acknowledge that the 1967 treaty was partly symbolic, this does not inherently prove that the modern constitution should not have change occur. She states that a treaty is a better option. A treaty does not have the same legal standing as the Constitution. Treaties are usually bilateral between nations rather than a group of people within the country. This shows how the current legal system does not work well with this. Now to my first point, that the colonisation of Australia was legally invalid and should be rectified through constitutional rights for Indigenous people. Charlie Calvo's Dictionary of International Law of 1885 states that Britain had 3 ways to legally go about colonising a nation in the 18th century in order to comply with international law. The first option of colonisation was occupation by means of war, which fortunately did not occur. The second was to claim ownership of the nation if the country was completely uninhabited by declaring terra nullius. The final option is to financially compensate Indigenous people for their land, respecting their values and rights. This would mean granting land rights and acknowledging rightful ownership. Australia was colonised under terra nullius, meaning land belonging to no one, and was considered completely uninhabited. As Captain Cook declared terra nullius in 1770, even Governor Arthur Phillip was rightly astounded to find inhabitants when he arrived in Sydney during 1788. He stated, "Sailing up into Sydney Cove, we could see natives lining the shore, shaking spears and yelling." Clearly, terra nullius was falsely declared, but it was accepted and unchallenged for 204 years, till this was overturned in Mabo versus Queensland No. 2 in 1992. The High Court of Australia notes that its role is to interpret the Constitution and ensure constitutional governance is upheld. As such, when terra nullius was officially overturned by the High Court, it showed a systemic shift in the attitudes of the legal system. Despite this recognition by the High Court, constitutional change is still important. The 1996 Wick decision clearly demonstrates the potential for pastoral leases to impinge on native title and Indigenous right, and several examples such as WA versus Ward excluded native title from rights to minerals and petroleum. The current legal system rejects terra nullius as a principle, yet legislation enables actions which do not protect native title. Hence, the solution is to retract this invalid principle at a constitutional level. Accordingly, Australia should have been colonised under a treaty, whereby land is purchased and the rights of Indigenous people are recognised. Australia is the only country in the Commonwealth which does not have a treaty between Indigenous people. New Zealand protects the Maori people through the Treaty of Waitangi, which is signed by Captain Hobson and 540 Maori chiefs. The USA constitutionally recognises these things similarly and grants Indigenous sovereignty. Canada specifically recognises Indigenous rights in Section 35 of their constitution, which existing Aboriginal and treaty rights of the Aboriginal peoples of Canada are hereby recognised and affirmed. Many countries colonised through Britain without invoking terra nullius have had more harmonious outcomes with explicit recognition of Indigenous people in their constitutions. As such, this outdated and incorrectly applied legal principle must be rectified. The only way to guarantee that terra nullius is overturned and to bring about our nation's constitution to a global standard is to recognise the inherent rights of Indigenous people in our constitution. Now, to my second point. The recognition of Indigenous Australians is necessary to promote and protect their rights. Section 25 of the Australian Constitution states that any race can be disqualified from voting at elections for the more numerous House of Parliament of the state. This enabled Indigenous people to be excluded entirely from voting up until 1965. Under the current Constitution, nothing prevents this from happening again. Dr. Joe McIntyre, a senior lecturer at Adelaide University, noted that the Constitution was written by white males to serve the interest of white males. The Constitution in its current form permits blatant racial discrimination. It is imperative that inherently discriminatory clauses be removed to ensure clarity and prevent discrimination against Indigenous Australians through misuse of our Constitution. Section 51, subsection 26 of the Constitution is also susceptible to misuse. This subsection states that the government may make laws for the people of any race whom it is deemed necessary to make special laws. It is imperative that the rights of Indigenous people are explicitly declared to counter this inadequacy with the Constitution. These sections fail to uphold Section 7 and 9 of the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, whereby Indigenous people should be treated equally before the law. In 2012, Australia faced scrutiny from 53 countries on 145 issues, according to the United Nations. A prominent issue was Indigenous discrimination. While Australia has limited legislation to promote universal human rights and, to some extent, Indigenous rights, one 2014 report, also from the United Nations, found that Australia's government has only implemented 11% of the human rights changes it, quote, accepted needed to occur. This shows that the Australian government does not effectively legislate on Indigenous issues. This is worsened by the fact that all the rights of Indigenous people could be repealed by our Parliament at any time, in accordance with the current Constitution. Constitutional recognition would ensure that the rights and the values of Indigenous people are established and universally protected. Clearly, other means of promoting rights, like legislation, are ineffective. As such, the best way to explicitly prevent racial discrimination is to clearly delineate the rights of Indigenous people in the Constitution and uphold rights which the legislature cannot otherwise guarantee. Thus, constitutional recognition should exist to ensure the rights for Indigenous people are guaranteed. Thus, to conclude, ladies and gentlemen, we must amend our Constitution to better recognise the value and rights of Indigenous people. When Australia was unjustly declared an uninhabited nation, it set a racist precedent which remains evident in today's Constitution. At the time the Constitution was written, Indigenous people were not treated as equals and had no land rights whatsoever. It's clear we cannot rely on a document which was created under the falsehood that Australia was terra nullius. We cannot have a document which guides the very operation of this democracy rely on outdated principles from 1901. Thus, we must change the Constitution to acknowledge Indigenous people. Thank you.
To continue the negative case, please welcome Nicholas.
Good evening, Madam Chairman, ladies and gentlemen. The topic for tonight's debate is that there should be constitutional recognition of Indigenous Australians. We, the negative team, unwaveringly believe the statement to be false. I'd first like to point out some flaws in the ideas of the affirmative's argument. Both affirmative speakers have tried to tell you that this requires change to the preamble and the Constitution doesn't reflect contemporary values. However, enacting a treaty would be a better reflection of contemporary values. Pure preamble changes are symbolic, but just that. More substantive action in the form of a treaty would be more beneficial to Indigenous lives. This idea is exemplified by my first point, which states that Indigenous communities favour a treaty with a 70% approval rating over constitutional recognition, which only received 30% approval. Thus, this shows that there is better change in other areas. Also, both speakers try to say that recognition is needed to protect rights and remove racism. However, evidence shows Indigenous Australians are not interested in constitutional recognition, as exemplified in my first point today, and instead, they better think their rights are protected and protection against racism lies in a treaty. Both speakers today have also made the case that constitutional recognition is beneficial to Indigenous Australians as it is currently outdated and excludes Indigenous Australians. While this contains an element of truth, there was widespread belief in the Indigenous community that constitutional recognition will enact very little substantive change. with Indigenous leaders such as Tatu Sainsbury saying that he thinks constitutional recognition lacks substance and real impact. Additionally, many Indigenous people believe that constitutional recognition exists within a system that majority of Indigenous Australians are against, and that they are handing over their voice and sovereignty the very moment they embrace the Australian Constitution, something that they oppose. Furthermore, majority of Indigenous Australians are against constitutional recognition, with support being around 30%, evidence of which I will exemplify in my first point today. Thus, advocating for constitutional recognition is an example of ignorance towards the Indigenous voice, beliefs and wants. Our first negative speaker has excellently illustrated the points that constitutional recognition holds very little weight and that a treaty offers much more effective action for reparations towards the Indigenous community. Today, I will speak to you about how Indigenous Australians are uninterested in being recognised in the Constitution, and I'll make the point that the very nature of constitutional recognition makes it an example of non-Indigenous Australians making decisions for Indigenous Australians. Firstly, the majority of Indigenous Australians are uninterested in being recognised in the Constitution, and instead have pushed for the formation of more substantive change. I'd like to start my point by stating some facts. In this survey conducted by Indigenous X, an Aboriginal community organisation, only 25% of Aboriginal respondents wish for constitutional recognition, with over 87% of respondents voting against constitutional recognition in favour of a treaty. Victorian traditional owners rejected constitutional recognition outright in a state government forum in preference of the recognition of sovereignty via treaties or other means. 500 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people unanimously opposed constitutional recognition in the Aboriginal Affairs Consultation Meeting. South Australian Indigenous NAIDOC Lifetime Achievement Award winner and campaigner Tatu Sainsbury estimates that 60 to 70% of the Aboriginal people are interested in treaties rather than the 20 to 30% that support constitutional change. In a Voice to Parliament submission, a poll revealed only 29% of Indigenous respondents supported constitutional recognition, whereas there is majority support for a treaty, with 59% approval. These statistics, these facts, and these collective opinions, they echo throughout Indigenous communities across Australia. They represent something. They represent that the majority of Indigenous Australians are not supportive of constitutional recognition. Nayuka Gore is an Indigenous activist who says a treaty forces you to see me as an equal with a separate identity, history, culture that has existed for tens of thousands of years. Recognition forces me to ask for you to be seen in a colonial system that I don't want to legitimise. She calls upon an alternative, a treaty, which creates more impactful solutions that more accurately and effectively address the situations our Indigenous populations face. The Indigenous population wants reparation for the crimes committed against them, but to offer them the solution of constitutional recognition is insulting. To enact constitutional recognition when a large majority of the Indigenous population directly opposes this idea contradicts what we are trying to achieve. The Indigenous population calls for support and change, but they're not calling for support and change in the way of constitutional recognition. There is clear evidence of this advocacy. If we wish to address these issues and address the core of the problem, what do Indigenous people of our land want? With only a 25% support margin, it is evident that constitutional recognition is not the favoured solution. Gilhart Anderson, founder of the Indigenous Sovereign Union movement, says in the book Sand Talk how Indigenous thinking can change the world. Constitutional recognition threatens to swallow up our Aboriginal sovereignty, and Aboriginal people are being tricked into handing over their very voice and sovereignty the very moment they embrace Australian Constitution. With a multitude of Indigenous people blatantly opposing constitutional recognition, to continue to advocate for this recognition shamelessly ignores the Indigenous voice. Secondly, this is an example of non-Indigenous Australians making decisions for Indigenous Australians. Control of Aboriginal sovereignty and land rights are being handed to and handled by non-Indigenous Australians. According to the Australian Rights Committee, the Australian Constitution can only be altered by referendum and a double majority in Parliament, unless it is the purely symbolic preamble. A referendum vote does not represent Indigenous thoughts and values. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people represent 3.3% of the total Australian population. To pass constitutional recognition, a large majority of non-Indigenous persons will be voting on Indigenous issues. How is this an accurate reflection of the wants of the Indigenous community? How can Indigenous persons get the result and reform they are looking for with a referendum vote. To endeavour to enact change via constitutional reform directly contradicts the fundamental intent of this proceeding. To represent Indigenous voice, to provide solutions to the issues that face their community, Indigenous peoples must be able to make their own decisions regarding their representation. As I established in my first point, the majority of Indigenous population are not in support of constitutional change. To continue to push for constitutional recognition represents a blatant disregard for the Indigenous voice. The control and handling of this sovereignty by constitutional systems threatens and risks the undermining of this sovereignty. The current push for constitutional recognition continues to allow Indigenous lives to be dictated by non-Indigenous authority, and thus there should not be constitutional recognition for Indigenous Australians. In conclusion, Madam Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, while this debate raises good points, spreads light and discussion onto an important issue, it is somewhat ironic. Who are we to say whether there should be constitutional recognition? Isn't that a discussion, a debate, and a conclusion that needs to be determined by those affected, those that this whole issue surrounds? The Indigenous population not wanting constitutional recognition, not as a majority. They see much clearer and more effective solutions in the other alternatives and continue to pursue, and the continuation of pursuing constitutional recognition continues the historic cycle of ignorance towards Indigenous voice. Thank you.
To conclude the affirmative case, I call upon Max.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Good afternoon, sorry. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. The topic of today's debate is that there should be constitutional recognition of Indigenous Australians. As the affirmative team, we believe this to be the case. We have defined the model of how this recognition should be put in place in reference to the Uluru Statement from the heart, and with a few other appropriate forms of recognition. We believe that there should be constitutional recognition in the preamble, which currently lays out purposes and the conditions under which Australia was formed. And we also believe that there should be several clauses altered, added, or removed to explicitly guarantee Indigenous rights, which my team members have laid out for you. Now, the opposition has laid out a few additions to the definition, which I'd just like to clarify. They have referred to the, across the debate, they have referred to the changes as being purely symbolic. However, in the definition, as they lay out, there are many definitions of what Indigenous recognition refers to. In this case, we have referred to Indigenous recognition being as some legitimate changes in that it guarantees Indigenous rights and it guarantees an Indigenous voice in Parliament. However, they have not referred to this and purely described it as purely symbolic. Those are real impactful changes, guaranteeing those Indigenous rights and guaranteeing that Indigenous voice. That is a real and impactful change. And furthermore, as I'll discuss later, symbolic does not necessarily mean it is a bad. So as I continue with my rebuttal, they've described the decision as purely symbolic. Again, a decision can be symbolic while still having value. There is value in showing a reconciliation between the government and the Indigenous communities. To suggest that it's symbolic and tokenistic does not mean that it is without value and should not happen. And as I discussed earlier, the establishment of an Indigenous voice in Parliament is far from symbolic. They also stated, the first speaker also discussed the impact that previous symbolic decisions have made, and referenced that after Kevin Rudd's apology, that there was still 7 times the rate of Indigenous children being taken away from their families. That may be the case, but that's one statistic. That's hardly showing the overall impact of that apology. That statistic is not reflecting the societal and cultural changes that apology brought about, and how it made us, how it showed Australia's awareness of the previous past faults, and how it was a step towards reconciliation between the Indigenous communities and the government. one statistic routing a 7 times rate, it does not show the full extent of the impact of the decision that the apology had. Both opposition members have stated that there are better alternatives exist through the treaty. And we can acknowledge that there is value in a treaty, but that does not suggest that constitutional recognition is also a value. Those two are not mutually exclusive points. We can have constitutional recognition with a treaty on top. If we view most similar countries in that we view the US and we view Canada, they both have constitutional recognition of the Indigenous Australians and treaties. Those two go together and they worked in tandem to guarantee Indigenous rights. Yes, as both my team members discussed this earlier. And furthermore, both are required for what they ask you. In the guaranteeing of Indigenous sovereignty, first we would have to acknowledge those, constitutionally acknowledge the Indigenous Australians as separate from Australia in order to enact those policies. So the Australian Constitution relies on the external affairs power in section 51 to make treaties Under this section, it is not possible to make a treaty with the Indigenous Australians as they are not considered foreign powers. Again, to consider them foreign powers, that would require constitutional recognition of the Indigenous Australians. Yes, the second speaker further illustrated that point regarding the treaty being of value, and that's what the Indigenous Australians want. Again, both of these can be of value. The second speaker also referred to evidence of showing that Indigenous Australians was not referred, and referred to a repeated statistic of the 20 to 30% being, only 20 to 30% being interested in that constitutional recognition. Again, so looking at that statistic, I cannot speak as to the specifics, but as we have established throughout this debate, that there are multiple definitions under which constitutional recognition is explored. Therefore, we can't really state that that statistic to be representative of all forms of constitutional recognition. That statistic could be statistic is likely only in response to one form of constitutional recognition and not all. So we can't assume that Indigenous Australians would not be in support of constitutional recognition in all forms. Yes, and they also continue to state that this specific study that I referred to echoes throughout the Indigenous opinions, without explaining why. They simply stated that it referred to they referred that the study was a representative of all Indigenous voices. However, we can't extrapolate a study like that. It's a single study. The second speaker also stated how the method by which a constitution would be changed would inherently exclude that Indigenous voice. Now, that may be true, but that's not impactful in this debate, as we were arguing whether or not the change should occur. That does not imply that the voice is being excluded in that decision, and we're not suggesting. We agree that the referendum should be changed, and we acknowledge that there might be a flaw in that referendum process, how it treats the Indigenous voice. But that does not suggest that the change to the Constitution should not be made just because it has to be made through these current methods, these current flawed methods. It's not impactful that the Indigenous voice may be underrepresented in that vote. It is still of value to make that change, as the topic statement that there should be constitutional recognition of Indigenous Australians does not speak to the method by which the change would come about. Now to my summary of my team's case. Our first speaker, Emil, discussed how the purpose of the Federation was to exclude people of colour from Australia, and how it's largely exclusionary and discriminatory towards Indigenous Australians, and therefore constitutional recognition of Indigenous Australians would be of value for reconciling that past conflict and showing support for the Indigenous community and being inclusive to it and showing an inclusivity as a country. He also referred to this significant symbolic value of the preamble in laying out the conditions in which Australia was formed and the purpose of Australia as a nation, and how specifically an example of this he gave was that it referenced the Christian God under which Australia was formed, which is disrespectful and not considering the Indigenous belief systems in terms of their relationship with the land. And how changes to this preamble would effectively be able to show how respect towards those Indigenous people and reconcile past conflicts. Our second speaker, Dylan, discussed the terra nullius upheaval in 1980 and how this provides some form of a legal imperative towards this change, and it demonstrates the unethical nature of the current constitutional recognition of Indigenous Australians. Currently, Australia was formed under the claim of terra nullius, which allowed for Australia to be formed without constitutional recognition of Indigenous Australians and without a treaty. Now that terra nullius has been upheaved, the implications of this have not been fully realised in our current recognition of Indigenous Australians that would be required to meet standards of international law. We also discussed the current discriminatory clauses included within the Constitution and how recognition of Indigenous Australians would be able to effectively guarantee Indigenous rights and prove to be of value in showing our support for the Indigenous community and not allowing repeated and racist policies to occur which have been occurred throughout Australia's history. Overall, in conclusion, we would like to establish that we acknowledge that there can be various forms by which constitutional recognition can take place. We have referred to a single model throughout our debate, but this debate is specifically about constitutional recognition overall. While some of our methods of showing that specific model may have their flaws, we strongly believe that there should be constitutional recognition of Indigenous Australians in some form. Thank you.
To conclude the negative case and this afternoon's debate, I call upon Finn.
Good afternoon, Madam Chairman, ladies and gentlemen. The topic for this debate is that there should be constitutional representation of Indigenous Australians. We, the negative team, believe this statement to be false. The first affirmative speaker has tried to tell you that constitutional recognition could help to alleviate the injustices of the past. However, in the face of the injustices in question, the invasion, genocide, and cultural eradication of Indigenous Australians, followed by centuries of unapologetic dismissiveness, the idea that the support offered by even the most radical, unrealistic forms of constitutional recognition is a reasonable response to the suffering of Indigenous peoples is insulting. The Indigenous peoples of Australia have spoken, as substantiated in our second speaker's point. They will not accept constitutional recognition. They want sovereignty. They want independence. And I question whether the affirmative team would actually present with the Indigenous community with the idea that a fitting recompense for the prosecution of their people is recognition within the government of their colonisers. The first affirmative speaker has also tried to tell you that constitutional recognition is an important step towards rectifying Australia's crimes against Indigenous peoples. However, we maintain that symbolic change should not be tabled, should not even be considered until the real, tangible problems still faced by Indigenous communities are fixed. A discussion should not be held over the semantics of constitutional representation and the implications it holds for the academic view of cultural politics. While Aboriginal youth are 15 times more likely to end up in the youth justice system, and Indigenous men die almost 10 years younger than their non-Indigenous counterparts. Over the last 5 years, there has been a slew of government funding cuts to vitally important Aboriginal legal services, while in the same period, there is heavy bipartisan support for constitutional reform. I hope the hypocrisy is clear. In the words of Aboriginal elder and former Tasmanian Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Commissioner Rodney Dillon, we've got a lot of our kids locked up in the justice system. We've got substance abuse problems. Tell me, is changing the Constitution going to help that? The first affirmative speaker has also tried to tell you that symbolic displays are powerful and stated the constitutional preamble as an example of this. However, while the negative team does acknowledge that there is some inherent power in cultural symbolism, symbolic change will never be effective as equivalent, tangible, practical change. This is particularly true within the context of this debate. Just look at the long and ineffectual history of symbolic displays offered to the Indigenous peoples within Australia. At every turn, the symbolic displays by the government have proven ineffectual exercises in performative activism. For example, Kevin Rudd's apology to Indigenous Australia. In the words of Professor Lynette Russell, with over a decade of hindsight, the national apology can be seen to stand as a monument, but ultimately futile gesture. 10 years on, little has changed, and progress is glacial. I could also speak of the 1967 referendum. In the words of Larissa Berhart, professor at the Junamba Indigenous House of Learning at the University of Technology, Sydney, many Indigenous people say they had heightened expectations about what would be achieved by the referendum, and they woke up to find that nothing had changed. This rejection of symbolic displays and call for practical change is still present in Indigenous communities today. In a referendum of Indigenous Tasmanians, it was found that they urged for practical change, not just symbolic recognition. Or when Indigenous leaders from around the country met with the Prime Minister and leader of the opposition in 2017, they said that they were sick of symbolism and that if Tony Abbott was serious, he would start the conversation about a treaty. The second affirmative speaker has stated that treaties exist between countries, not people within a country. However, this is just false. Every single Commonwealth country, except Australia, has a treaty with their Indigenous population. Australia is the only state which consistently refuses its Indigenous people a treaty, and instead offers cultural recognition. The second affirmative speaker has also tried to tell you that we are the only Commonwealth that does not have some form of constitutional recognition. However, the critical difference between Australia and the other countries in the Commonwealth is that the Indigenous peoples of these countries were clamouring for recognition, while in Australia they do not. Evidently, other Commonwealth countries are better at us than this. Our response has been so disappointing that Indigenous peoples don't even want constitutional recognition. The debate has moved past this decades ago. They want a treaty. The second affirmative speaker has tried to tell you that Aboriginal peoples in Australia have historically suffered from great injustice, and thus they need constitutional recognition. However, we, the negative team, wholeheartedly agree that the crimes levied against Aboriginal people in Australian history, and to this day, are appalling acts, and agree with the affirmative team's sentiment that it is vital that they receive some form of compensation. However, this is exactly why we suggest a treaty. A treaty in Australia would recognise Indigenous people's history of their prior occupation of the land, as well as the injustices they have endured. It is a redefinition and restructuring of the relationship between Indigenous people and wider Australia. However, constitutional recognition lacks the ability to offer these things because it is recognition within the Australian economy, Constitution. The third affirmative speaker has stated that an Indigenous voice proposed by the Uluru Statement isn't symbolic. However, the Indigenous voice in Parliament proposed by the Uluru Statement from the heart is, by definition, symbolic. It is a purely symbolic position that can advise Parliament. Its opinion does not hold substantive or legislative value. The third affirmative speaker has also tried to tell you that constitutional recognition is a stepping stone towards a treaty, and that we can have both. However, to advocate for constitutional recognition when the majority of the Indigenous population rejects this community is an example of ignorance towards the Indigenous voice. Furthermore, many members of the Indigenous community have stated that constitutional recognition is including them within a system that the majority of Indigenous Australians are against, and that they are handing over their voice and sovereignty the very moment they embrace the Australian Constitution, something that they oppose. Additionally, an important act of Indigenous identity, sovereignty, is removed when the constitutional recognition is granted. But this important sovereignty is exemplified in just a treaty. Therefore, with clear opposition and risks to Indigenous identity, for example, constitutional recognition must not occur, and a treaty instead. Constitutional recognition is not an effective alternative. The third negative speaker has stated that just because constitutional recognition has to be passed through a referendum, it does not mean that the constitutional recognition itself isn't good. However, this is an unrealistic, unnecessarily theoretical argument. The reality is that a referendum and constitutional recognition are inexplicably tied. To ignore one reduces any conversation had on this point to pointless theory crafting. Our first speaker spoke to you to highlight the ineffectuality of constitutional recognition. She then went on to explain how a treaty offers a much more effective alternative for reparations towards the Indigenous community. Our second speaker spoke to you about how Indigenous Australians are uninterested in being recognised in the Constitution. He also presented his argument that because constitutional recognition would have to be passed through a national referendum, it is intrinsically an example of non-Indigenous Australians making decisions for Indigenous Australians. So, Madam Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, In conclusion, we the negative team still unwaveringly disagree that there should be constitutional recognition of Indigenous Australians. To be honest, I regard today's debate as less subjective than others. We've come here to describe what is best for Indigenous Australians. When the debate has been had for us, Indigenous Australia has come to a decision.
upon a member of the adjudication panel to come forward and award the debate.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I introduced myself before. My name is Paul Hoadley. Congratulations to both teams on making it to the grand final today and for such an entertaining debate. It's very enjoyable. As each of the 5 adjudicators arrived at his or her decision independent of the others, we won't provide any individual feedback. Today's decision was a split decision of 3-2. The winner of the grand final for 2020 at senior level was the Affirmative team from Pembroke School.
member of the runner-up team from Brighton High School to give a vote of thanks.
Well, what a season. I guess it all ends now, I don't know. I don't know what I'm going to do with my free time anymore. Thanks to the audience for coming out and the adjudicators. Thanks to the timekeeper and chairperson for watching the debate. Thanks, that was a really fun debate. We were just sitting here saying it was such a fun debate. Really competitive, you guys did an excellent job. And yeah, just thank you to Debating SA for facilitating all this and managing the throw season together with every member of this. Great. Thank you, everyone.
I call upon a member of the winning team from Pembroke School to second that vote of thanks.
And first, I'd like to thank the audience for coming out. It's great to see so many people here. It's great. And also thanks to the chairman and the timekeeper for helping us run the debate. Thanks to the 5 adjudicators for doing a fantastic job tonight. And finally, thanks to the opposition for a fantastic debate. You debated fantastically, and I can see how it was a very close decision. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for your attendance, and I now declare this debate closed.
Okay, so just before